Three men in tailored suits walked into the lobby of Ashcroft Meridian, flashed executive badges, and announced that Owen Rourke was terminated on the spot. When the single father refused to hand over the leather case holding his audit files, they locked the doors, ripped the phone from his hand, and forced him to his knees in front of every employee in the building. Nobody dared to step in until the company's own chief executive, Vivian Ashcroft, came running through the crowd, ordered the men to stop, and stared straight into their eyes. Then she said the sentence that froze the entire room. They had just attacked the man who owned the very company writing their paychecks. If stories about power, hidden ownership, and quiet men who turn out to be far more dangerous than anyone expected keep you hooked until the very last second, press subscribe now so you never miss what happens next on this channel. On an ordinary Monday morning, Owen Rourke stood in a small kitchen in Chicago, scrambling eggs for his 12-year-old daughter before the school run. Tessa sat at the counter, swinging her legs, asking why her father still drove a car that rattled at every red light when her grandfather always said Owen could work anywhere he wanted. Owen only smiled and told her that money mattered less than knowing you were doing something right, a line she had heard 100 times but never quite believed. He kissed the top of her head, packed her lunch into a worn canvas bag, and drove her to school in the same sedan he had owned for almost a decade. Neither of them spoke much about the past, about the years before Owen's wife died, about the man he used to be inside boardrooms far grander than the one he now quietly walked into every day. That morning, like every morning, he simply became invisible the moment he stepped through the revolving doors of Ashcroft Meridian's downtown tower. The building rose more than 40 stories above the Chicago skyline, humming with the constant motion of a company preparing to close one of the largest acquisitions in its history. A new receptionist, barely a month into the job, glanced at Owen's badge and told him the visitor entrance for contractors was around the side. Since his card carried no listed title, Owen didn't argue. He simply nodded, walked the longer route, and noted, as he always did, how differently people spoke to those they assumed had no power. Inside the open floor plan of the Risk and Compliance Division, colleagues called him the spreadsheet man, unaware that the numbers he was quietly checking involved contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He answered to no title anyone could point to, carried no company car, and asked for no assistant, which made him easy to overlook and easier still to underestimate. He kept the same worn leather case at his side every single day, its edges softened from years of use, its lining stitched by hand after the original seams had begun to fray. Few people ever asked what he carried inside it, and fewer still would have believed the truth if he had told them outright. Owen preferred it that way. Anonymity had become less a disguise and more a discipline, a way of testing whether the people around him behaved with integrity even when they believed no one important was watching. He had learned, over years of quiet observation, that character revealed itself most honestly in rooms where power seemed entirely absent. That morning, as always, he took his usual seat near the window, opened his laptop, and began the unglamorous work of reconciling numbers that most executives never bothered to read past the summary page. Ashcroft Meridian was racing toward the final stage of a deal to acquire a leading aviation navigation firm, a transaction valued at $4.6 billion. Vivian Ashcroft, the company's chief executive, was under enormous pressure from the board and from a syndicate of banks to close before the end of the week. She had spent years clawing her way to the position she now held, surviving a bruising internal struggle within her own family's company before finally earning the trust of a board that once doubted whether she could lead at all. Conrad Bellamy, the company's chief operating officer, pushed her constantly to skip several vendor verification steps in order to protect the timeline. That morning, Owen sent Vivienne a short internal notice flagging irregular payments tied to one of the firm's security contractors, a company called Vailcrest Corporate Risk. Vivienne never had the chance to respond since she was already on her way to meet with the banking syndicate and a handful of nervous investors. Bellamy, however, noticed Owen's name attached to the flagged report and quietly instructed his assistant to find out exactly which files the man had been reviewing. By mid-morning, Owen had pulled every payment record tied to Vailcrest going back 2 years, cross-referencing them against staffing logs and contract renewals. He discovered 17 so-called rapid response security teams that had been paid in full despite having no matching personnel files anywhere in the system, a pattern repeated so precisely across 4 separate fiscal quarters that it could not have been an accident. Every one of those invoices had been approved using Conrad Bellamy's own authorization code. Altogether, the missing funds totaled nearly $47 million, siphoned quietly through a contractor most employees had never even heard of. The strangest entry of all was a line item labeled Emergency Restructuring Fee, scheduled for payment that same afternoon, despite the fact that no restructuring emergency existed anywhere in the company's records. Owen picked up the phone and called Vailcrest directly, hoping to reach someone senior enough to explain the discrepancy before it disappeared into the books entirely. The call was routed to a regional director named Trent Harlan, a man who introduced himself with the practiced confidence of someone used to being obeyed. Trent had no idea he was speaking to the true owner of his own company, and his tone made that ignorance obvious within seconds. He spoke down to Owen, telling him that any questions about staffing needed to go through, in his words, the proper channel of management. Owen, careful not to reveal who he really was, simply asked who had authorized the specialized response teams listed on the invoices. Trent ended the call abruptly, then immediately phoned Conrad Bellamy to report that some low-level contractor at Ashcroft Meridian was digging far deeper than he should have been allowed to. Within the hour, Elena Pierce, the company's general counsel, quietly warned Owen that the very files he had requested were already marked for deletion by someone with senior-level access, scheduled to vanish by the end of the day. Owen didn't panic, though his pulse quickened as he understood exactly how quickly the situation was escalating. He copied everything onto an encrypted drive and slipped it into the lining of an old leather case, the same case he carried to work every single day without anyone giving it a second glance. Hidden inside that case, alongside the financial evidence, was a physical key that unlocked a separate offline data vault, one very few people in the company even knew existed. Bellamy tried to lure Owen into a private meeting at a restaurant downtown, but Owen declined without explanation, which only made Bellamy more certain that the man needed to be handled quickly and quietly. Bellamy then set his emergency plan into motion, instructing Trent Harlan and 2 of his colleagues at Vailcrest to retrieve the case by any means necessary before the end of the business day. To make the operation appear legitimate, Bellamy supplied fake badge templates, a forged digital signature, and Vivienne's private travel schedule, giving the impression that everything had been approved from the very top. Just before noon, Owen received an anonymous message on his personal phone warning him to leave the building before midday, or every person in that office would be convinced he had never truly belonged there at all. At exactly 11:48 in the morning, 3 men stepped through the revolving doors of the lobby, dressed in expensive tailored suits and carrying leather folios stamped with the Ashcroft Meridian crest. Trent Harlan led the group, flanked by 2 colleagues named Mason Kells and Derek Voss, both wearing the same confident, practiced expressions as their leader. Because Bellamy had quietly added their names to the building's approved visitor list, security waved them through without a second glance. Trent introduced himself to the floor manager as the Emergency Corporate Restructuring Director claiming the board had granted him full authority to suspend any employee deemed a threat to the pending acquisition. Several mid-level managers, terrified of losing their own positions, immediately fell into line and began ushering staff toward the main lobby. Within minutes, Trent had commanded nearly every employee on the floor to gather in the open reception area, creating an audience for what was about to happen next. Owen was summoned down from the upper floors and brought to stand directly in front of the assembled crowd. Trent deliberately referred to him as the storage contractor, mocking his plain jacket and worn shoes in front of colleagues who had never once bothered to learn his actual role. He accused Owen of unauthorized data access, of stealing sensitive files, and of causing significant financial harm to the company's ongoing transaction. Owen calmly asked to see the board resolution that supposedly granted Trent this authority. Trent produced a document bearing an electronic signature that appeared, at first glance, to belong to Vivian Ashcroft herself. It took Owen only a few seconds to recognize that the signature had been lifted directly from an old, unrelated contract filed months earlier. He asked for the resolution's registration number and the name of the certifying attorney, questions Trent had clearly never anticipated having to answer. Rather than respond, Trent shifted immediately into threats, warning Owen that if he handed over the leather case without further resistance, the company would decide not to pursue formal charges against him. From his office on the executive floor, Bellamy watched the entire confrontation unfold through the security cameras, fully convinced that Owen had finally been cornered exactly as planned. He leaned back in his chair with the satisfied posture of a man who believed the hardest part of his plan was already behind him. Several employees who had once dismissed Owen as unimportant now began whispering among themselves, wondering aloud whether he might actually be some kind of criminal. A few even recalled small interactions from months earlier, reshaping ordinary memories into something that suddenly felt suspicious, simply because a confident voice in an expensive suit had told them it should. Owen offered no defense and made no attempt to argue his innocence. Instead, he simply set the case down near his feet, though he never once released his grip on the strap. Beneath the sleeve of his jacket, his fingers found a small button hidden along the edge of his watch, quietly triggering an alert reserved exclusively for the true owner of Vailcrest Corporate Risk. The signal bypassed Ashcroft Meridian's own security system entirely and went straight to Owen's personal legal counsel instead. Sensing the situation slipping slightly out of his control, Trent ordered the lobby doors locked and instructed someone nearby to cut the feed from the public-facing cameras. He turned back toward Owen and announced, with a cold and deliberate calm, that there was no longer any need to pretend this gathering was an ordinary meeting. Trent nodded toward Mason, who stepped forward and reached for the leather case, still resting near Owen's feet. Owen warned them plainly that opening the case without the correct access code would automatically transmit its entire contents to an independent auditing firm. Trent dismissed the warning as an obvious bluff meant to buy time. When Mason yanked at the case, Owen refused to let go of the strap, holding firm even as the tension between them grew. Derek shoved Owen sideways into the edge of the reception desk, knocking him briefly off balance in front of the watching crowd. Trent seized the moment, wrenching Owen's arm behind his back and ordering him down onto his knees. There was no prolonged violence, only forceful restraint, a shove, and a clear threat meant to intimidate rather than injure. Owen chose not to fight back, aware that a secondary set of cameras, hidden and independent of the ones Trent had disabled, were still quietly recording everything. He kept his eyes moving through the crowd, studying which managers stood frozen in silence, and which ones seemed almost relieved that someone else had finally been humbled, filing away each reaction the way he once filed away numbers on a balance sheet, quietly and without judgment, simply as information worth remembering later. One younger employee took a half-step forward as if to intervene, only to be pulled back sharply by a department head who feared the consequences of defying the men in expensive suits. Trent snatched Owen's phone from his jacket pocket and threw it carelessly onto the marble floor, cracking the screen but not the resolve behind it. When the lock screen illuminated for a brief second, it revealed a photograph of Owen and Tessa laughing together at a lake somewhere upstate. Trent laughed as well, remarking that a man raising a daughter on a modest income would never risk everything over a handful of documents. Owen simply replied that Trent was mistaking his silence for fear, a distinction that would soon cost the other man far more than he realized. Somewhere above them, Bellamy called Trent's phone directly, instructing him firmly to move Owen down to the parking garage and retrieve the storage drive by whatever means proved necessary. Mason's confidence began to falter, since the original assignment had only ever mentioned recovering documents, never physically detaining another human being. Rather than react with panic, Owen calmly recited Trent's full internal employee code from memory, a number Trent had certainly never shared with him. Trent froze for a moment, visibly shaken that a man he considered nothing more than a low-level contractor somehow possessed information that specific. Owen continued, naming the exact date of Trent's promotion, the amount of his most recent bonus, and 3 internal complaints that had mysteriously never been investigated. Trying to mask his rising fear, Trent pressed down harder on Owen's shoulder, forcing him further toward the floor. At that exact moment, the elevator doors slid open, and Vivian Ashcroft stepped out into the lobby, flanked by Elena Pierce and the head of building security. Vivian's gaze moved from Owen kneeling on the marble floor to the badge clipped to Trent's jacket, and her voice cut through the silence like a blade. She asked, with icy precision, which one of them had been reckless enough to forge her own signature. Trent tried to hold his composure, insisting he was simply carrying out a resolution passed by the board of directors. Vivian asked him to state the resolution number aloud. When he handed the forged document to Elena instead, she scanned it in seconds and identified 3 glaring problems immediately. The legal seal attached to the page had expired more than a year earlier. The signature itself had been copied from a contract filed 14 months before that day. Ashcroft Meridian, she added flatly, had never once used a title like Emergency Corporate Restructuring Director in its history. Trent pivoted quickly, claiming that Vailcrest had been granted special authority by Conrad Bellamy to protect company assets during the transition. Vivian asked whether he was, in fact, a genuine employee of Vailcrest Corporate Risk. Confident in that much at least, Trent produced his real employee identification and held it up for her to see. Vivian turned toward Owen, silently waiting for him to confirm whether the badge was authentic, her expression giving nothing away to the dozens of eyes watching the exchange unfold. Owen offered only a small, quiet nod, the kind of gesture that revealed nothing to anyone who didn't already understand what it truly meant. Vivian immediately ordered building security to restore every disabled camera and seal off all exits from the lobby. Turning to address the crowd of stunned employees, she announced clearly that Trent Harlan and his companions held no leadership authority whatsoever within Ashcroft Meridian. They were, she explained, employees of an outside vendor who had chosen to use falsified documents to seize control of a situation that was never theirs to control. Trent still refused to back down, insisting that the chief executive of Vailcrest would personally protect him from any consequences. That was the moment Vivian delivered the line that would echo through the company for months afterward. Vailcrest Corporate Risk, she explained, had not answered to its old leadership for nearly 2 years. The entire company had been quietly purchased in full, and its sole owner was standing in that very lobby. Looking directly at Trent, she stated plainly that he had just assaulted Owen Rourke, the man who owned 100% of Vailcrest Corporate Risk. Silence swallowed the entire lobby. The very managers who had mocked Owen only minutes earlier now stared at the floor, unable to meet his eyes. Mason immediately released his grip on the leather case and stepped backward, while Derek insisted this had to be some kind of elaborate trick designed to intimidate them. Elena calmly pulled up a certified ownership record, confirming that Rourke Stewardship Holdings held the entirety of Vailcrest's shares. Owen instructed all three men to surrender their badges, their company-issued phones, and any remaining access to internal systems immediately. Trent still refused, clinging to the belief that Bellamy would somehow shield him from what was coming. Exercising his authority as sole owner, Owen suspended the entire regional leadership team of Vailcrest on the spot, effective immediately. Every device the three men carried lost system access within seconds, each screen displaying the same simple message that their accounts had been revoked by order of the owner. Despite the humiliation unfolding in front of dozens of witnesses, Owen took no visible satisfaction in the moment. Instead, he turned to Vivienne and asked her to help him locate Conrad Bellamy, since these three men were merely instruments, not the true architects of what had happened that morning. When security reached Bellamy's office moments later, the room stood completely empty. According to the internal system logs, he had already convened an emergency session of the board of directors, apparently determined to have Vivienne removed from her own position before the day was over. Connecting remotely to the emergency board session, Bellamy accused Vivienne of deliberately hiding a conflict of interest, claiming she had long known that Owen secretly controlled one of the company's key vendors. He painted Owen as a covert investor quietly manipulating Ashcroft Meridian from the shadows for personal gain. Several board members grew visibly uneasy, worried that any public scandal could unravel the massive acquisition entirely. Seizing on their hesitation, Bellamy proposed suspending Vivienne immediately and installing himself as interim chief executive until the matter could be resolved. His voice carried the practiced calm of a man who had rehearsed this exact moment many times before, certain that fear alone would carry the vote in his favor. Moments later, Vivienne walked into the main boardroom herself, with Owen and Elena following close behind her. The room fell quiet as she took her seat at the head of the table, her expression unreadable to anyone who did not already know her well. Owen chose not to sit anywhere near the head of the table, taking a seat instead near the far end, a decision that only reinforced Bellamy's continued underestimation of him. Several board members exchanged uneasy glances, clearly uncertain which version of the morning's events they were meant to believe. The tension in the room felt almost physical, thick enough that even the quiet hum of the ventilation system seemed too loud. Bellamy told the assembled board that the earlier confrontation in the lobby had simply been a misunderstanding tied to a routine asset recovery process. He brought Trent Harlan into the meeting as a supposed witness to support his version of events. Trent testified that Owen had resisted and initiated the physical altercation himself. In response, Owen calmly requested that the room review footage from the building's secondary, independent camera system. The recording showed clearly that Owen had never once struck back or resisted with force. Far more damaging, however, was the accompanying audio, which captured Bellamy's own voice ordering his men to take Owen down to the parking garage and secure the drive by any means necessary. Bellamy attempted to argue that the recording could easily have been fabricated or manipulated. Elena countered by producing the original call logs pulled directly from company-issued devices, complete with internal authentication codes that could not be forged. Cornered, Bellamy shifted tactics and began threatening the board directly, with the consequences of exposure. If this investigation became public knowledge, he warned, the banking syndicate would almost certainly withdraw its financing overnight. The company's valuation, he insisted, would collapse within days, and thousands of employees could lose their livelihoods as a result. Owen pointed out, calmly and without hesitation, that this very fear was precisely why Bellamy had chosen this specific moment, just before the deal's closing, to act. He wanted the board so terrified of scandal that they would quietly bury the truth rather than confront it. Rather than pulling paper files from the leather case as everyone in the room expected, Owen retrieved something else entirely. A small, unassuming physical key granting access to an offline data vault, completely separate from the company's main network. The data stored there proved that Bellamy had invented entire security teams that never existed, funneling $47 million through 7 separate shell companies scattered across 3 different states. Each shell entity had been registered using slightly altered spellings of legitimate vendor names, close enough to pass a careless glance, but distinct enough to keep the money moving without detection. One of those shell entities carried a name directly tied to Grant Bellamy, Conrad's own younger brother, a man who had never once appeared on any Ashcroft Meridian payroll or organizational chart. Elena traced the banking trail methodically, laying out timestamps and wire transfers on the boardroom's main display until even the most skeptical board members could no longer deny what they were looking at. The pattern was too consistent, too deliberate, and far too well hidden to be dismissed as an accounting oversight. Given the chance to reduce his own culpability, Mason agreed to cooperate fully and tell the board everything he knew. He revealed that Trent had been quietly preparing a staged security incident inside one of the company's manufacturing facilities, timed to occur shortly after the acquisition closed. The plan, Mason explained, was to make the newly acquired technology division appear unsafe and unstable, driving down its perceived value so it could later be sold off cheaply. Vivienne realized in that moment that Bellamy's ambitions reached far beyond simple theft. He intended to sabotage one of the company's most valuable strategic assets. Just as the board prepared to call a formal vote, every screen in the room went dark without warning. Bellamy had triggered a high-level administrative override in a desperate attempt to erase the company's central data records before anyone could act. Staring at the darkened screens around the boardroom, Owen told the stunned executives that Bellamy had just made his final and most costly mistake, because the very system he was trying to erase had never actually belonged to Ashcroft Meridian in the first place. Owen explained, in clear and measured terms, exactly how the emergency backup infrastructure had been designed under the original Vailcrest contract. Administrative control of that system, he reminded them, ultimately rested with the vendor providing it, which meant it rested with Owen himself. Bellamy's override could only reach the version of the data displayed inside Ashcroft Meridian's own network. It could never touch the original archive stored offline. Reaching into the leather case one final time, Owen used the physical key to restore full access across every screen in the boardroom. The displays flickered back to life, revealing a detailed, real-time log of every action Bellamy had taken over the previous several minutes. His frantic attempt to delete the evidence had, ironically, become the clearest proof yet that he understood exactly how guilty he truly was. Owen immediately ordered a full independent audit of Vailcrest's operations from top to bottom. More than 30 accounts connected to Trent's regional office were frozen within the hour. Owen replaced the entire temporary leadership structure with an outside team of independent auditors, cutting off any remaining influence Bellamy might still hold. Trent, realizing the full extent of what he stood to lose, understood that every hidden bonus and disguised payment tied to his name had already been uncovered. In a final attempt to soften his own situation, he offered to hand over private messages exchanged between himself and Bellamy. Derek continued to refuse cooperation, but Mason willingly surrendered his personal device to investigators without hesitation. The messages revealed that Bellamy had promised Trent a share of Ashcroft Meridian stock once Vivian had been successfully removed from power. Standing before the board, Vivian admitted openly that she had been so consumed by the pressure of closing the acquisition that she had overlooked warning signs she should have caught much earlier. She refused to shift the blame onto anyone beneath her, choosing instead to take full responsibility for the oversight herself. That honesty shifted the mood in the room, and several board members who had wavered earlier began quietly siding with her once again. Bellamy made one last attempt to convince them that Owen's true intention was a hostile takeover of the entire company. Owen responded plainly that he had no interest whatsoever in acquiring Ashcroft Meridian or claiming the chief executive's chair for himself. His only goal, he explained, had been to prevent a company he happened to own from being twisted into a weapon used against innocent people. He proposed delaying the acquisition by 72 hours, giving the board time to thoroughly re-examine every piece of data connected to the deal. Such a delay could easily cost the company millions of dollars, he acknowledged, but moving forward under a cloud of concealment risked losing everything the company had ever built. Vivian agreed without hesitation, fully aware that the decision placed her own position at further risk. When the board finally called the vote, the result was close, but ultimately favored her leadership. Bellamy's access was revoked on the spot, and he was formally instructed to appear before the company's independent legal investigators without delay. As security escorted him from the room, Bellamy leaned toward Owen and murmured quietly that the $47 million was merely the surface of something much larger, and that someone inside Vivian's own office had been quietly helping him for years. Although Vivian didn't fully trust anything Bellamy said at that point, she agreed it was worth reviewing everyone with close access to her office. Digging through the access logs, Owen discovered that Vivian's personal schedule, her signature template, and the special visitor codes used that morning had all originated from a single account belonging to her executive chief of staff. That position was held by a man named Nathaniel Crowe, a longtime advisor deeply connected to the Ashcroft family for more than 2 decades. Crowe had played a significant role in helping Vivian secure her position as chief executive, and she had trusted him completely ever since. When confronted directly, Crowe insisted his account must have been compromised by someone else entirely. Rather than accuse him outright, Owen asked Elena to quietly pull the building's entry and exit records for verification. The data revealed that Crowe had met privately with Conrad Bellamy at an exclusive private club on 6 separate evenings over recent months. Under continued pressure, Crowe finally admitted that he had shared Vivian's schedule, though he claimed he genuinely believed Bellamy only intended to pressure her into closing the acquisition faster. He insisted he had never known that Vailcrest's team planned to physically confront and detain Owen inside the lobby, and for a moment his voice cracked with what looked like genuine regret rather than practiced performance. Vivian studied him for a long moment before responding, searching his face for some sign of the man who had once taught her how to read a balance sheet when she was barely out of college. Vivian felt a deep and personal sting of betrayal, realizing that someone she had trusted completely had valued the family's reputation more than the safety of the people working for her. She reminded him quietly that trust, once spent carelessly, rarely returned to its original value, no matter how long the two of them had known each other. Crowe pleaded with her to keep the matter quiet, arguing that protecting the Ashcroft name mattered more than any public accounting of what had happened. Vivian refused outright. She told him plainly that a powerful name meant absolutely nothing if it depended on the forced silence of people with far less power than her own. Watching the exchange unfold, Owen realized that Vivienne was fundamentally different from the wealthy heirs and executives he had encountered throughout his earlier career. Together, they agreed to disclose the full findings of the investigation to the board, to the banking syndicate, and openly to every employee within the company. Crow was suspended immediately. His phone and laptop surrendered directly to the legal team for further review. Trent formally signed a cooperation agreement, providing complete documentation of every unauthorized assignment he had carried out under Bellamy's direction. Mason admitted candidly that he had known from the start that the badges were fraudulent, but had trusted Bellamy's assurance that everything would be legitimized after the fact. Owen made a point of reminding everyone present, in a calm and even tone, that the true failure that day wasn't limited to 3 men wearing forged credentials. It extended to the hundreds of employees who had witnessed something clearly wrong unfolding and said nothing, simply because a confident voice and an official-sounding title had told them to stay silent. In response, Vivienne committed to overhauling the company's entire security protocol and its internal reporting structure from the ground up. The following morning, Vivienne walked out onto a small stage set up before the entire assembled staff, and rather than defending her own position, she invited Owen to stand beside her at the very center of the room. Vivienne addressed the full company directly, confirming publicly that the 3 men who had claimed authority the previous day held no actual power within Ashcroft Meridian whatsoever. She withheld only the specific details that might compromise the ongoing legal investigation, but openly acknowledged that the company's internal safeguards had failed everyone that day. Employees who had stayed silent out of fear were reassured that honest reporting would never again be met with punishment or retaliation. Several mid-level managers who had physically restrained others from stepping in were asked to undergo a formal review of their leadership conduct. The young employee who had once tried to intervene, only to be pulled back by a nervous supervisor, was publicly recognized for showing courage even without any real authority behind him. Owen stepped forward and offered only a short, direct statement to the room. Badges, he reminded them, could be forged. Titles could easily be stolen or misused by the wrong person. Real power, he said, always carried responsibility alongside it, and it could always withstand honest scrutiny. He made a deliberate choice not to frame his ownership as some kind of personal triumph or victory lap, choosing instead to thank the young employee who had tried to step in and the handful of others who had quietly reported strange irregularities in the weeks before the confrontation ever happened. He reminded the room that courage rarely looked dramatic in the moment it was needed most. More often, it looked like a single person willing to ask an uncomfortable question when everyone else in the room had already decided to stay quiet. In the days that followed, Vailcrest Corporate Risk underwent a complete structural overhaul from top to bottom. Every contract lacking full transparency was formally canceled and replaced under stricter oversight, with new verification requirements demanding at least 2 independent signatures before any large payment could be released. An independent ethics board was established specifically to monitor the company moving forward, staffed by outside professionals with no personal ties to Owen, to Vivienne, or to anyone previously connected with Bellamy's regime. Employees who had once feared retaliation for raising concerns were given a confidential channel to report suspicious activity directly, bypassing regional management altogether. 3 days later than originally planned, Ashcroft Meridian finally closed its acquisition, though under significantly stronger and safer contractual terms than before. Conrad Bellamy, Trent Harlan, and everyone else connected to the scheme now faced a lengthy road of formal investigation and legal consequences. Mason's willingness to cooperate earned him some consideration for reduced liability, though he still lost his position and faced serious professional fallout of his own. Grateful for everything Owen had done, Vivian offered him the position of chief executive at Vailcrest itself. Owen turned the offer down, unwilling to return to the kind of demanding, all-consuming career that had once cost him precious time with his daughter. He explained, quietly, and without any trace of regret, that he had once lived for boardrooms exactly like the one they were standing in, and that the version of himself who thrived there had also been the version who missed dinners, missed school recitals, and missed the quiet ordinary evenings that never came back once they were gone. Instead, he accepted a role as independent oversight chairman, one that allowed him to work on a far more flexible schedule of his own choosing. Rather than treating fatherhood as some kind of professional weakness, Vivian respected his decision completely and without hesitation, telling him plainly that a man who protected his daughter's evenings as fiercely as he protected a company's integrity was exactly the kind of steward Vailcrest needed watching over it. Afterward, Vivian turned to Owen and asked him something she had been wondering since the moment the truth came out. Why would a man who owned an entire company allow himself to be treated as an ordinary employee for so long? Owen answered honestly, admitting that he once believed ownership alone could tell him everything he needed to know about how a company truly operated. After becoming a single father, however, he came to understand that no financial report could ever capture how people treated one another when they assumed no one important was watching. Choosing to live and work anonymously had given him a clear, unfiltered view of exactly that truth. A few weeks later, Ashcroft Meridian reopened its main lobby to the public once the entire security system had been thoroughly reformed. Its new protocols quietly praised by employees who finally felt safe raising concerns without fear of retaliation. Tessa stopped by the office one afternoon to share lunch with her father, marking her final direct appearance in the story. She wore her school backpack over one shoulder and carried a paper bag with 2 sandwiches she had helped make that morning, insisting on splitting the cost of her father's coffee from her own small allowance. Several employees seemed genuinely surprised to see that Owen still carried the same worn leather case and wore the same plain, unremarkable shoes as always, as though ownership of an entire company should have somehow rewritten the man himself. Vivienne happened to meet the two of them in the lobby that same afternoon, pausing mid-conversation with a colleague the moment she spotted them near the window. Rather than offering him some extravagant private office, she simply handed him a new identification badge. The card carried no title reading owner or chairman anywhere on its surface. The only words printed across it read, "Full access, full responsibility." Tessa asked whether that meant her father was now the most important person in the entire building. Owen told her gently that the most important person was always the one who continued doing what was right, even when nobody around them knew their name. Before heading home with Tessa that evening, Vivian invited Owen to join her for dinner, quietly opening the door to something new built on mutual respect rather than wealth or position. She suggested a small, unremarkable place near the river, far from the private clubs and reserved tables that usually accompanied someone in her position, and something in the choice told Owen she meant exactly what she said about wanting something genuine. Owen accepted without hesitation, allowing the possibility of a slower, more genuine connection to take shape between them, one built not on titles or holdings, but on the simple fact that each of them had watched the other choose integrity when it would have been far easier not to. As the story drew to a close, Owen walked back through the very lobby where he had once been forced to his knees. This time, not a single person lowered their gaze because they had learned how much money he possessed. Instead, they looked at him with genuine respect because they had witnessed firsthand exactly how he chose to use the power he held. Some nodded as he passed, others simply stepped aside without being asked, and a few of the very managers who had once mocked his worn shoes now greeted him by name for the first time in months. None of it changed the way Owen carried himself. He still walked at the same unhurried pace, still carried the same battered case, still planned to be home in time to help Tessa with her homework before the evening ended. Power, he had come to understand long before that morning in the lobby, was never really about what a person owned or what letters followed their name on a badge. It was about what they chose to do in the moments when no one was watching closely enough to notice, and what they refused to do even when everyone around them assumed they could get away with it. In a building filled with forged badges and borrowed titles, Owen Rourke had proven, quietly and without a single raised voice, that real power never needed to shout in order to be recognized.